Hi, everybody. Welcome to Chapter 18, Financial Management. The poster child is Kathy Waller. She's the CFO, the Chief Financial Officer of Coca-Cola. And Chief Financial Officers, to say that they have a complex, busy day is an understatement. I mean, Kathy ultimately oversees 500 products in 200 countries, okay? And each of these countries has different tax rates, different currencies, different currency fluctuations, different supply chains. Things may get disrupted in country A, and then you have to figure out a way to get the raw materials to keep that supply chain going. So you're juggling a lot of balls. Now they have help, and clearly they're very well paid, as they should be. But if you think about it, you're really kind of a CFO yourself, a Chief Financial Officer. If you're budgeting for yourself or budgeting for a household, I mean, eventually you will be at some point. Controlling, the money supply, right? And the goal really is to maximize your income. That shouldn't come as a surprise. I'm assuming many of you are going to college for the purpose of maximizing your income down the road. And but then once you've got that bucket of funds, you then have to decide how to allocate it. Think of it in terms of a pie, for example. I mean, how can we make the pie as big as possible, and then how do we slice it up to make sure people get equitable slices? Now, in the case of Kathy Waller at Coca-Cola, the slices aren't equal, nor should they be. It's a very complex job, but with all those different countries and all those different products, you want to look where you're going to get the biggest return on investment. Okay, so you're maximizing your cash flow, and you're also trying to maximize return on investment. Now, in Kathy's case, she looks at which products are performing the best, and those get a fatter slice than parts of the business that are not performing quite as well. So you're juggling a lot of balls, for lack of a better way to say it too. So as I say, she gets help. She gets a lot of data from accountants. That's in the book. They'll say accountants are people who provide the information to chief financial officers to make the strategic decisions. Now, going back to a previous chapter, we talked about strategic versus tactical. Okay, so Kathy typically makes strategic decisions, meaning budgetary ones for the course of the upcoming year. Tactical is short term. So the strategic budget is the long-term budget, the annual budget, for example, of a company. And you've got your priorities. One is ensuring that there's lots of free cash available to keep the lights on, to pay your utilities, pay your employees, pay your insurance, pay your rent, etc. So you got to pay the current bills. You need to allocate some money, sort of what I would call a rainy day fund, in case for contingencies. Now, 2020 was the year of contingencies, wasn't it? We had COVID, we've had all kinds of other issues. And so that clearly meant a huge fluctuation in financial income for companies. Now, you could sort of tell who, Warren Buffett used to have an expression. He'd say, when the tide goes out, you can see who's swimming naked. And the financial world isn't much different than that. You could see which companies have provided good financial planning. When you have a year like you did last year in 2020, you know which companies have stepped up and planned properly in case something goes off the rails, like a lot of things did last year. So they're still around, those companies that planned accordingly and did have a rainy day fund and did have contingency plans. The others that were totally caught off guard, and everybody to some extent was caught off guard, but the ones that had good contingency plans are still around today. So keep that in mind if you're starting up your own business. Okay, A, put together some rainy day money, and B, have a contingency plan just in case things go a little bit sideways. And again, in the case of a CFO, it's the case of she looks at those products and says, okay, well, papaya Coke's not selling too well these days, so we're going to cut the budget 50%, and then we're going to give that 50% to the snack food that's taking off and just has been a huge hit since we released it. Goes back to the other comment that I made about stars versus dogs, so on and so forth. You know, some products are going to become dogs at some point. The cash cows are the ones that provide the steady income, and you need to support those. But you also need to put money towards the stars, the ones that are taking off and gaining market share in a growing market. Okay, so allocate it appropriately. But let's rewind the clock here. Let's pretend it's day one at your company, and you're in charge, of course, and you're both the CEO, the Chief Executive Officer, and the Chief Financial Officer. So one thing you need to look at is capitalization. Okay, how well funded are we? And so that means how much money do we have today to get the business started? How much money do we need to bring in to continue to fund the operations? What's the burn rate of our company? Every week and every month, how much money are we going through? And we need to estimate it low and high. Okay, so we can come up with an average cash burn. That's easy enough. But most companies should come up with a range of how much is going to get spent, and account for seasonality too. Okay, holidays, people are gone, people are off, revenues may drop for us. So I've worked for startups, and one of them went belly up, out of business, and that's because they had very poor cash management. They spent a lot of money on things they really didn't need. They bought too much real estate, or leased too much real estate, purchased too much furniture, too many computers, that type of stuff, sent people on too many trips, and the cash burn did not equal the revenue. Now, they had a really good product. That's the most frustrating thing. They had a great product, but they weren't bringing in a consistent revenue to support the costs that they had incurred, and therefore something had to give. And in this case, it was the company saying, okay, well, we can't go on as an entity the way we are, and unless we find an investor to recapitalize us, and they couldn't. So because they didn't have a track record of either being responsible with the burn rate or increasing the revenues of the company. They were growing, but not growing fast enough, okay, to cover the costs. So there's that issues. Most companies have patterns of cash flow. You look at a health club, for example. Well, they have a fairly steady membership base, and they charge X amount of dues per month. And so, of course, COVID threw it off, but by and large, health clubs can look and say, okay, well, we have X amount of fixed costs every month, and we have X amount of relatively fixed revenue coming in because, yeah, we add members, we lose a few, but we can count on each member paying $50 a month or whatever the dues are for the health club. So on and so forth. And that's something that's a good thing. And people are more happy to finance those things, because if you say, okay, look, we can depend on this income stream, then people say, all right, well, you've got a well-defined income stream and a good business model will help support you. So there's that. On the flip side, ski resorts, very seasonal revenue stream, right? I mean, clearly in the winter you make a lot of money, in the summer you don't. But in a nutshell, to kind of sum all this up, the three most common reasons companies fail financially, and this is in the book: undercapitalization. You didn't have enough money to start your business and grow it, and that's what happened to the company I worked for. Is they were bringing in revenue, but again, not enough revenue and they weren't growing fast enough to give any lender comfort that they were going to be able to meet their costs. So they were undercapitalized, and it put them out of business. Poor control over cash flow. The company had that too. Okay, they spent money where they didn't need to. They should have focused all of it into research and development and cut back on the real estate, cut back on the furniture, computers, etc. Inadequate expense control. They also had that. I mean, don't send one person on a trip, not three. So there's that. Yeah, things to keep an eye on. And now we're going to say hello to my little friend again. Okay, this for many of you looks familiar, right? The financial plan. And on one side, we have short-term forecasting. On the other side, we have, if you're looking at it the way I am, to the right, long-term forecasting. And then I did switch below that because actually capital budget is a long-term budget. The cash budget is sort of your operating budget. And then financial controls. So you put together the plan, you look at these four factors: short-term forecasting, long-term forecasting, capital budget, cash budget, and then you reevaluate and say, what type of financial controls do we need to put into this? So all in all, you just have to define how do we keep a consistent amount of money coming in, and how do we maintain our cost structure? And that's a lot of things for a CFO to do. It's a very iterative and interrelated process because you're dealing with a lot of variables and a lot of different levels of company management. So, food for thought. You may also say, what's a cash budget versus a capital budget? So cash budget is the short-term payments, okay? Again, the rent, the utilities, the payroll, etc. The capital budget is when you're putting together your long-term plan, you're going to say, okay, well, we're going to need to do a few things to build the foundations of the business. We may need to expand a building. We may need to add more inventory. We may need to hire 3 more employees. So those are long-term expenditures, hence they're called capital expenditures. Typically from a standpoint of when you're doing your tax returns, if you invest in something that's got a useful life of 3 years or longer, that's a capital expenditure, okay? I had a little trouble in Monday's lecture coming up with bulldozer, but a bulldozer is a great example of a capital expenditure. Okay, that's something that you buy, it's a large financial outlay, and it's supposed to have a useful life of 3 years or longer. So a bulldozer, in fact, would be a capital expenditure. Many others: buildings, plants, trucks, heavy equipment, things like that, all capital expenditures. I guess from a tax standpoint, can you depreciate these things over a period of time? If you can, capital expenditure. Cash budget, again, is short-term, and when you think of short-term, you should think of tactical, and when you think of long-term, you should think of strategic. That takes us about a quarter of the way through the chapter, so I'll leave it here. And then we'll pick up with video number 2 for the first part of Chapter 18. Right back.